The wind howled through the Bitterroot Mountains, screaming past the trees like something alive. Snow fell in waves, heavy and relentless, burying everything beneath a blanket of white silence. The trails that once meandered through the forest were gone, swallowed up in the storm. Mountains loomed above, ridges vanished behind walls of snow, and even the riverbeds had frozen solid. Nothing moved. Nothing dared. It was just past noon when Dakota stepped off the wooden porch of the Grayson family cabin, his paws crunching into the fresh powder. He didn't hesitate. His massive frame, built for the cold, moved with a kind of instinctual grace. The Alaskan Malamute paused only once, glancing back at the log home nestled among the trees. His amber eyes glinted like fire against the pale storm. Then he turned and disappeared into the white. The Graysons had trusted him with their lives before. On hikes through snowfields across icy ridges, Dakota always returned. Always. But that day felt different. Sarah stood wrapped in her coat, arms tightly folded, watching the woods with eyes full of growing worry. Her husband, Jake, had binoculars pressed to his face, scanning the ridgelines. Their children sat by the frosted window, whispering Dakota's name, voices soft and unsure. Every few minutes one would call out louder, hopeful, but no bark answered. No crunch of snow under returning paws. 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3. The snow erased all signs of where Dakota had gone. No tracks, no prints, no sounds. The forest, once alive with motion and noise, had turned into a silent trap. A wall of white, a void. "He's smart," Sarah whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it truer. "He always comes back by sunset." But her voice betrayed her. The calm was breaking. Fear crept in behind every syllable. Dakota had never been out this long in weather like this. Not in a blizzard that reduced visibility to a few feet. Not when temperatures were plunging by the hour. By nightfall, the thermometer dipped below 0. The trees outside groaned under the weight of snow, and the wind pushed against the cabin like fists pounding at the walls. Jake and Sarah took turns on the porch, shining a flashlight into the storm, calling Dakota's name over and over again. Sometimes they paused, ears straining for a bark, a whine, a sound, anything. But there was nothing, just wind and darkness. Inside, the children refused to eat. They curled beneath blankets on the couch, Dakota's favorite toy clutched in one hand, his blanket in the other. Every creak of the floor, every shift of the wind outside, made them sit up and look toward the door. But it didn't open. The night stretched long and merciless. No one slept. When morning came, the storm had eased, but it hadn't passed. Instead, it had transformed the forest into something unrecognizable. Trees bent beneath ice, paths vanished completely. The world outside had been wiped clean and rewritten in shades of white and grey. Jake didn't speak. He didn't need to. He laced his boots, packed his REI snowpack, grabbed a set of emergency flares, and stepped into the cold. Sarah watched him from the porch, tears clinging to her eyelashes like frost. He didn't promise to find Dakota. He didn't say he'd be safe. He just walked into the woods, the same way Dakota had the day before. The kids pressed their faces to the window. The house was quiet, too quiet. It had once echoed with the clatter of paws, the low bark at dusk, the soft huff of a dog dreaming. Now it was still. The silence was unbearable. That day, Sarah paced between the windows, unable to sit still. Her phone buzzed non-stop. Neighbours checking in, volunteers offering to help, officials asking for updates. She responded to none. She just kept watching the tree line. Every hour without a sign felt like a year. By late afternoon, Jake hadn't returned. More people had joined the search. Locals from Derby, park rangers, even a rescue team equipped with drones. The Graysons printed out maps, highlighted areas, described Dakota again and again. Big, they said. Grey and white. Looks like a wolf but friendly. He always comes when called. But the forest didn't listen. It didn't care. It swallowed footprints. It swallowed sound. It swallowed dogs. Sarah stood in the yard until her boots sank into the snow and her legs went numb. Still she watched. Still she whispered Dakota's name. The sun dipped behind the mountains. Darkness crawled in again. Inside the cabin, no one turned on the lights. Day turned to night. Then night into another day. And still Dakota was gone. The forest was too large, the snow too deep, the silence too complete. And yet they couldn't give up. They wouldn't. The second day dawned colder than the first. The sky, once a turbulent swirl of clouds and wind, had settled into a dull, motionless grey. Snow draped the world like a funeral shroud. It coated the roof of the Grayson cabin, buried the firewood pile, and bent every branch until the trees looked like kneeling giants. Sarah didn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen, boots still on, coat zipped to her throat, eyes red from tears that froze before they fell. Jake was already gone before sunrise, slipping into the forest with his snowpack, a flare gun, and the same desperate determination that had pulled him out the day before. He hadn't spoken more than a sentence since Dakota vanished, and now, as he pushed through chest-deep snowbanks and past trees stripped bare by the wind, he said nothing at all. Every breath came out in tight, white clouds. The cold clawed into his lungs, but he barely noticed. Volunteers arrived in groups. Locals from Derby brought dogs bundled in winter jackets, stomping through the snow with hesitant steps. Park rangers set up a makeshift search hub. A rescue team unpacked gear near the cabin, thermal drones, infrared scopes, radios. Everyone had questions. Everyone asked what Dakota looked like. And again, the Graysons repeated it. He's huge. Alaskan Malamute, grey with white patches. Looks like a wolf. Friendly. Always comes when called. But it didn't matter how many times they described him. The forest remained silent. The drone flew overhead, its soft mechanical hum the only thing that pierced the air. Jake watched the screen as the image flickered. White, more white, the occasional smudge of a tree stump or a shadow that vanished when examined closer. No movement, no heat signatures, just the frozen spine of the mountain, indifferent and empty. Back at the house, Sarah handed out maps with shaking hands. The children hadn't spoken in hours. They sat wrapped in Dakota's blanket, whispering to each other in a language only siblings know, made of hope and fear, and the kind of belief that only children are still allowed to have. But even that belief was starting to waver. 3 days in, and the desperation turned sour. Sarah didn't make coffee anymore. Jake had stopped shaving. The kids no longer asked where Dakota was. They just looked toward the door, their faces blank, their eyes rimmed red. Grief had begun to settle in, not as an explosion but as a slow, cold seep. Jake moved deeper into the forest. The wind had reshaped everything. Landmarks he once knew by heart were gone, erased by the storm. Trail markers buried, trees stripped of bark, everything smooth, white and unfamiliar. He called out Dakota's name between breaths, his voice cracking in the air like a whip. It echoed and vanished. Behind him, the sounds of the searchers wavered, someone calling, someone whistling. But no answers came. Not even the wind seemed willing to reply anymore. Sarah's voice, hoarse and worn, still rang out from somewhere far below, calling again and again. It no longer sounded like hope. It sounded like panic, not the screaming kind, but the quiet kind, the kind that clutches the lungs and makes breathing feel like drowning. A kind of silent scream that no one else hears. Up on the second ridge, the snow was deeper than Jake had seen so far. He dropped to one knee, using his shovel to clear a small path. His eyes scanned the ground with the reverence of someone reading sacred text. A pine cone, a scrap of bark, but nothing more. The silence closed in again. Behind him, 3 neighbors, men from town, wrapped in blaze-orange jackets, trudged through the snow like ghosts. Their dogs moved cautiously, tails low, noses twitching. Even they, the bloodhounds trained to search and track, seemed unsure. It was as if the forest had stolen their certainty too. Cassie, the youngest bloodhound, suddenly froze. Her body stiffened, nose to the ground, legs bracing. She pulled toward the creek bed, once a bubbling stream, now a frozen sheet of brittle ice. Everyone followed. At the edge of a clearing, she stopped, just stood there. Jake moved to her side, and there, half buried in snow, was a single paw print. Large, deep, the edges iced and curling in. Jake dropped to his knees, brushed away the snow with trembling gloves. A broken spruce branch lay nearby, stripped on one side. Clumps of fur snagged in the bark. No other tracks, no trail, just a footprint in the snow. Alone. Sarah arrived minutes later, falling to her knees beside Jake. Her cheeks were raw from the cold, lashes rimmed with frost. Her breath came in short, shivering bursts. "Do you think it's him?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't answer. He didn't have to. The forest had finally offered them something, but not comfort, just a riddle. One clue in an ocean of cold. The sun slipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. The wind returned, gentle but biting, carrying with it the scent of ice and distance. Sarah stared at the print as if she could force meaning from it. How far had Dakota travelled? Was he nearby? Had he passed through days ago, wounded, alone? No one could say. But as the air sharpened again into frostbite and silence, one thought echoed in every heart, thudding like a quiet drumbeat beneath their ribs. How many more days could he survive out there? Alone. On the morning of the 11th day, the sky finally opened. The storm clouds that had cloaked the mountains in shadow parted to reveal a sharp, bitter blue. The sun glinted off the snow like shards of glass, and the cold was no softer, just clearer, crisper, cutting deeper with its silence. Trees no longer groaned beneath new snowfall. They stood frozen and still, like statues bearing witness. Inside the Grayson cabin, no one spoke. There were no more updates, no more calls from volunteers or rangers, no more neighbours dropping off soup or supplies. The flyers pinned to poles at the edge of the road had gone stiff, their corners frozen, no longer fluttering. Everything had settled, even hope. Jake sat by the window, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tight. His eyes hadn't moved from the edge of the tree line in hours. Sarah stood behind him, arms folded, unmoving. She hadn't changed her posture since sunrise. Both of them stared at the same spot, the same patch of woods that had swallowed Dakota and refused to give him back. And then, at 9:12 a.m., something flickered. It was nothing at first, just a shift in the line of trees, a slow, almost imperceptible shape moving against the white. Jake leaned forward, squinted. His breath caught. A figure emerged from the trees, slow, heavy, limping. His voice cracked when he spoke. Sarah. But she was already moving. She didn't wait to hear the rest. Her boots slammed against the porch boards as she burst out the door. Behind her, the children were already calling out, their voices sharp with disbelief, rising in a crescendo of joy and fear. Through the blinding snow came Dakota. He was dragging himself step by step, each movement laboured. His coat was caked in ice and mud. His legs trembled. One paw barely touched the ground, swollen and raw. He was thinner, visibly gaunt beneath his thick fur, and his head hung low as if the weight of the journey had nearly broken him. But his eyes, those bright amber eyes, still burned. He collapsed at the bottom step of the porch. Sarah dropped to her knees in the snow, cradling his massive head in her lap. Tears spilled down her cheeks, warm enough to melt the frost in his fur. She sobbed his name again and again, brushing the ice from his ears, whispering that he was home, that he had made it, that they had missed him so much. Jake knelt beside them, one hand stroking Dakota's neck, too overcome to speak. The children wrapped their arms around the dog wherever they could reach, his back, his shoulder, his tail. They were crying, laughing, crying again, not even bothering to wipe away the tears. In that moment, nothing else existed. The blizzard, the empty days, the clawing silence. It was all erased by the sheer miracle of Dakota's return. But they didn't see the second shape, not at first, not until it moved. It was small, so small it could have been mistaken for a bundle of snow or a chunk of ice caught in Dakota's fur. But then it shifted, stepping forward hesitantly. A tiny creature with trembling legs and wide, unblinking eyes, round, barely larger than a squirrel. Frost clung to its whiskers. Its paws, far too big for its body, sank slightly into the snow as it pressed close to Dakota's side. A kitten, but not an ordinary kitten. A bobcat, 4 weeks old at most. Bones visible beneath his matted coat, pads of his paws cracked and bleeding. He should have been dead, should have frozen, should have starved. But he wasn't. He was here, and he wasn't afraid. He didn't run when Sarah gasped, didn't flinch when the children leaned in closer. He simply stayed, pressed into the warmth of Dakota's fur, so tight that his small body nearly vanished beneath the dog's chest. Dakota shifted, just barely, just enough to nudge the kitten closer with his paw. Jake's voice was barely more than a breath. He brought him back. The bobcat blinked slowly, calmly, his breathing shallow but steady. When Dakota lifted his head slightly, the kitten nuzzled beneath his chin and closed his eyes. He hadn't just followed Dakota, he had been carried. Sarah whispered the thought aloud. He thinks Dakota is his mother. Inside the cabin, the fire roared to life, throwing light across the wooden floor. Warmth returned to the space like a rising tide. Towels were laid out, water bowls filled. Dakota was lifted gently onto a blanket by the fire. The kitten remained close, crawling over the vet's hands, curling into the crook of Dakota's leg and refusing to move. He didn't growl, didn't hiss, he purred. A sound that didn't belong to the wild, didn't belong to fear or survival. It belonged to safety, to home. As Sarah knelt beside them, watching the two bodies, one massive, one tiny, tangled in a nest of blankets and warmth, she felt the question rise in her chest, cutting deeper than any cold wind. Where had they been all this time? And how, in a wilderness built to destroy, had they found each other? The kitten was named Briar, and though his ribs still showed and his paws were raw, he didn't cry. He didn't tremble. When the vet approached with stethoscope and gloves, Briar stayed exactly where he was, tucked against Dakota's chest, his breath sinking with the dog's laboured rise and fall. When they tried to lift him, Briar panicked, not with fear, but with desperation. He scrambled back to Dakota's fur, burying himself like a cub who had just found the only thing that had ever kept him alive. And maybe he had. They didn't just survive the storm, they survived each other. At first, the vet didn't want to examine the bobcat. He stood back, arms folded, eyes narrowing. "We don't touch wild cats," he said carefully, his voice carrying a practiced caution. "They can carry disease, they can bite, they belong in the wild." His tone wasn't unkind, just procedural, firm, the way professionals speak when balancing emotion with protocol. But Briar didn't hiss. He didn't growl or bare tiny teeth. When the vet reached toward him with gloved hands, he didn't react like something wild. He just looked at him with wide, unreadable eyes and pressed harder against Dakota's ribs. When they tried to lift him, gently, he scrambled, not from fear of the humans, but from fear of distance. His little claws clung to Dakota's fur like a lifeline, his whole body vibrating with panic. Sarah didn't need science to tell her what was happening. She saw it in his eyes. Briar didn't know he was wild. He didn't understand he was supposed to be alone. All he knew was Dakota. And Dakota, despite the fatigue, the frostbite, the open wounds on his paws and side, kept shifting to wrap his body around the kitten protectively. Finally, the vet sighed and relented. Briar was no more than 4 weeks old, too young to regulate his body temperature, too small to feed himself properly. His weight was dangerously low. Another night in the cold would have killed him. Perhaps even another hour. And yet he had lived, because Dakota had made sure of it. As they cared for the dog's wounds, Briar never left his side. When the vet cleaned the bandages or examined Dakota's limbs, Briar climbed over the man's hands like an obstacle course, returning each time to the hollow between Dakota's front legs. He would curl in tightly, paw pressed to the dog's chest, and fall asleep to the sound of a heartbeat that wasn't supposed to be his. Sarah sat nearby, a mug of untouched tea cooling in her hands. She watched the bobcat knead gently at Dakota's fur as though searching for milk that would never come. Not out of hunger, but out of comfort, out of memory. As if he truly believed Dakota had given him life. And perhaps, in a way, he had. The paw print Jake found near Glacier Ridge was more than 5 miles from the cabin. That meant Dakota had carried or guided Briar through frozen valleys, across jagged ridges, over rockfalls slick with ice, while starving, limping, injured. There were no words for it. It didn't make sense. But it had happened. At night, the fire crackled softly as Dakota slept on a folded comforter by the hearth. Briar curled into the space between his legs, tucked in tight. When darkness fell and the wind howled again outside, he never moved far, not even in sleep. His body remained anchored to Dakota's like a second heartbeat. He thinks Dakota is his mother. Sarah whispered, repeating the words again like a fragile truth she wasn't sure the world would believe. No one corrected her. No one laughed. Because in that moment, it wasn't just an animal rescue. It wasn't even just survival. It was something else entirely. By the second day, the bond between the orphaned bobcat and the wounded dog was impossible to deny. Briar followed Dakota everywhere he could. If the dog shifted, Briar shifted too. If Dakota groaned in pain and tried to rest his head, Briar would adjust his position until his small body curled along the line of Dakota's neck. When Dakota drank water, Briar would crouch beside him and mimic the movement, dipping his tiny tongue into the bowl with practiced reverence. It wasn't instinct alone, it was devotion. When Sarah tried to lift Briar just briefly to change Dakota's bandages, the kitten cried, not with fear but with fury. He clawed his way back down the blanket like the distance itself was unbearable. He had chosen his guardian. and Dakota, for all his pain and wariness, responded the only way he knew how. He lowered his head, pressed his snout into Briar's back and sighed, a deep, rattling breath that sounded like relief. The family was still trying to understand the miracle when the knock came at the door. A white SUV idled in the icy driveway. The woman who stepped out wore a thick green jacket, carried a clipboard, and had the neutral expression of someone trained not to react. She introduced herself calmly, her tone professional, careful. "We've received a report," she said, "about a wild bobcat being kept inside a private home." Sarah's heart dropped. "We understand the circumstances," the woman continued, "but we're required to follow protocol. The bobcat must be transferred to a licensed wildlife rehabilitation center." She paused, waiting for the weight of her words to settle. Sarah's throat tightened. Jake stepped forward, his hands clenched at his sides. "He's not just a wild animal," he said quietly. "He's a baby, and he thinks that's his family." The official nodded, not disagreeing, but unmoved. "We're not here to take him immediately. You have 72 hours to prepare for transfer. A team will arrive to collect the animal." She handed over a slip of paper with a date and time printed in bold. 72 hours. That was how long they had left. The door shut behind her with a sound that felt final. The silence afterward wasn't the quiet of grief anymore. It was the silence of a countdown. Dakota's eyes remained half-closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Briar had already curled back into his chest, fast asleep, unaware that anything had changed. Unaware that everything had. But the Graysons knew. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop glowing dimly in the dark. Her fingers moved fast, searching state codes, digging through wildlife regulations, cross-referencing rehabilitation statutes. Every article said the same thing. Wild animals, no matter how bonded, could not be kept in private homes. Unless she found it buried deep in an official policy manual. A clause. A thin one. Temporary, species-specific foster placement, allowed only under supervision of a licensed non-profit rehabilitation agency. Not common, not guaranteed, but possible. By morning, Sarah had sent 7 emails, made 5 phone calls, and then she did something else. She posted a petition. Let him stay. Don't separate a bobcat from the only family he knows. Within hours, it began to spread. Neighbours signed. Search party volunteers shared it. A woman from Derby who'd once lost a rescued fawn to a similar policy wrote in offering support, and then someone uploaded the video, just 30 seconds. Briar, tiny and shaky, climbing onto Dakota's back. The big dog didn't move. He just lay still, eyes half closed, as the kitten curled around his neck and rested one tiny paw on his muzzle, like he was hugging him. The video exploded. 60,000 views in a day. People didn't see a wild animal. They saw a baby clinging to the only soul who had saved him from death. Sarah sat in the corner of the living room, phone in hand, scrolling through the comments. This isn't about survival anymore. This is love. They need to stay together, whatever it takes. She looked over at them. Dakota asleep by the fire, Briar tucked beneath his leg like he belonged there. Because he did. Whatever the law said, whatever the rules demanded. Briar had already found his home. And the world, watching now, wasn't so sure it wanted to take that away. The letter came quietly, sealed in a plain white envelope with a state emblem pressed into its flap. No knock this time, no warning. Sarah found it in the mailbox just after sunrise, the cold already creeping under the door. She didn't open it right away. Her hands trembled too much. She brought it inside, sat at the kitchen table where the glow of the laptop had long faded, and stared at it for several minutes. When she finally unfolded the paper, the words stared back without mercy. In accordance with state wildlife regulations, the bobcat currently residing on your property must be surrendered to authorized personnel within 24 hours. No exceptions, no appeals. That was it. No emotion, no consideration for what they had survived, just protocol in black ink. She read it once, then again slower, hoping the meaning would change. It didn't. Her vision blurred. The paper slipped from her fingers. She stood abruptly and walked outside into the cold, coat unzipped, boots unlaced. She didn't say a word to anyone. Jake found her 20 minutes later, kneeling behind the woodshed in the snow, Briar wrapped tightly in her arms. The kitten was asleep, his head tucked under her chin, his breath fogging the front of her jacket. She was whispering to him softly, Something about staying strong, about not being afraid, about not letting go. When Jake crouched beside her, she looked up. "We can't let them take him," she said, her voice hollow, flat. "I know," Jake replied quietly, "but we can't break the law either." Sarah didn't answer. Her eyes stared into the trees, past the ridge, toward the same wild that had once taken Dakota and now threatened to take Briar. There were caves out there, old cabins, places no one would look. If we left him deep enough, she whispered, he might never be found. Jake didn't respond. He didn't have to. The thought had crossed his mind too, but before they could make a decision they couldn't take back. The phone rang. Sarah hesitated. The number was unfamiliar, the area code out of state. She answered. The voice on the other end was calm, direct and kind. "My name is Elena. I work with Northern Wildlife Alliance. We saw the video. We believe this case is different." Sarah didn't breathe. "We're a licensed non-profit," Elena continued. "We operate under special rehabilitation provisions. If the state agrees to transfer temporary guardianship to us, we can provide sanctuary and keep the animals together." A pause. Then, "But we need to act fast. The paperwork is complex. The clock's already ticking." Sarah's voice cracked. "You can keep them together?" "If we move quickly," Elena said. "Yes, but we'll need cooperation from the state and your full consent. And you may have to give up custody. Dakota too, for now." Sarah fell silent. Inside the house, Dakota lay resting on the rug, his breathing even but shallow. Briar was curled into him like always, one tiny paw resting on his chest, rising and falling with each breath. Could they be separated again and survive it? Jake listened on speakerphone, staring at the floor. Elena's voice came through steady. "We can save them both, but we need to move now." Outside, the sound of tires crunching over the icy driveway shattered the silence. A white state transport truck pulled up slowly, its back panel marked with the same government seal that was stamped on the letter. Two officers stepped out, faces unreadable beneath their winter hats. They carried a reinforced crate between them and a clipboard. Sarah stood on the porch, Briar swaddled in a blanket in her arms. He squirmed, sensing something off. His ears twitched, eyes darted. Inside, Dakota lifted his head slowly. The low whine that left his throat was soft but sharp, the sound of something ancient and pained. The moment Briar heard it, he writhed free from the blanket, dropped to the floor and ran to the dog's side. When the officers entered, the kitten hissed. Then he leapt, tiny claws digging into Dakota's fur, climbing up onto his back. He trembled violently, his body pressed tight to the dog's, as if trying to vanish inside him. His cries were shrill, panicked, like nothing that belonged in this world. Dakota stirred, lifting his head, ears twitching. He couldn't move much, but his eyes found Sarah's. They didn't leave hers. The officers paused. One stepped forward. Sarah moved between them, her arms out. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "just give us one more day." They shook their heads. "We're sorry. We have to proceed." Briar cried out again, shrill and raw. He clawed at Dakota's neck, refusing to be pulled away. His tiny body thrashed like he was drowning. He didn't understand. He thought they were taking his mother. Sarah covered her face. She couldn't watch. Then another sound. Tires on gravel. A second vehicle turned up the road, smaller, unmarked. It slid slightly as it stopped behind the state truck. A woman stepped out, a manila envelope in hand. "Elena," Sarah whispered. She walked quickly, bypassing the officers without a word, and stood beside Sarah. She gave her a short nod, then turned to face the state representatives. "I have a signed emergency order from the District Wildlife Court," she said clearly, handing them the document. "Verified, stamped, effective immediately." The officers took it. "Read it once, then again. Temporary joint placement," she continued. "Licensed sanctuary custody. The bobcat and the dog remain together under non-profit guardianship, transported together, monitored together." The officers exchanged glances. Then they nodded. No cuffs, no crate, just a new van. Heated, safe, 2 sleeping mats side by side. Jake carried Dakota out in his arms, slowly, carefully. Elena lifted Briar, who squirmed again, but this time only to reach for the dog. Inside the van, the kitten curled immediately into Dakota's side like a puzzle piece. No more panic, no more fear, just breathing, just rest. Sarah stood in the snow, her arms wrapped around herself, watching them through the glass. Her hands shook. Her eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in days, her heart felt steady. They were going together, not torn apart. not broken by the rules. As the van rolled away, tires leaving twin tracks in the snow, she whispered the only words that made sense. Sometimes, compassion is stronger than the law. The sanctuary was tucked deep within the forest, hidden where the trees grew thick and the world slowed down. Snow still blanketed the ground, but the edges had softened. Spring was beginning to press its fingers into the soil, loosening the ice, teasing life back into the earth. Here, in this quiet corner of wilderness, time moved differently. Dakota lay in a heated enclosure, his body wrapped in clean blankets. His wounds were healing slowly, his weight still low, his movements still stiff, but his spirit had not dimmed. Every time the door creaked open, his ears perked up, eyes flicking toward the sound, searching. When Sarah arrived with the children, bundled in winter coats and carrying his favorite rope toy, Dakota's tail thumped once. Then again. Then stronger. He didn't try to stand. He didn't need to. Briar had already seen them. He bounded across the room on oversized paws, still clumsy but stronger now, his body no longer skeletal, his fur glossy and full. Without hesitation, he leapt into the blanket, nestled into Dakota's chest, and let out a deep, rumbling purr. For the first 2 weeks, the Graysons came every day. They weren't allowed inside the enclosure at first, but they didn't mind. They stood behind the barrier, watching as Briar learned to eat solid food, to climb small logs, to swipe at falling snowflakes like a playful house cat. Every new skill was followed by a return to Dakota. Every nap, every strange sound, every uncertain moment led him back to the dog who had once shielded him from the wind. The sanctuary staff were patient and gentle. They monitored both animals closely, feeding them separately, tracking Briar's development, evaluating his readiness for independence. The conclusion was clear by the end of the 2nd week. Briar would survive. At 8 weeks, he no longer needed help feeding. At 9, he began sleeping in a separate enclosure just a few feet away from Dakota's, still visible, still near. At 10, he no longer cried when they were apart. He was adapting, and Dakota was watching. By the 11th visit, the sanctuary team sat down with Sarah and Jake. The decision was ready. He's ready, they said, and so is Dakota. Paperwork was signed. Guardianship for Dakota returned officially to the Graysons. Jake arrived alone to pick him up. Dakota stood on his own, slow but steady, his limp noticeable but not debilitating. As they led him to the car, Briar watched from a raised platform, eyes alert. He didn't chase, he didn't cry, but his ears followed every step. Back home, Dakota took his time. He moved slowly through the house, nose twitching at each doorway, every room a memory. The kids welcomed him with wide arms and whispered words, treating him like a hero returned from war. Sarah wept when he curled up in front of the fireplace, resting his head on the same spot he had once shared with Briar. Jake built a new bed by the hearth, soft and thick, lined with the same blanket that had once wrapped them both. And then, every Sunday, without fail, they made the drive back to the sanctuary. They didn't need reminders or appointments. It became routine, a ritual, a promise. Briar would be waiting by the gate long before they arrived. And when Dakota stepped from the car, the bobcat would run, no longer as a kitten, but as something stronger, faster, sharper, yet still familiar, still full of recognition. They would meet in the tall grass of the outdoor enclosure. No leash, no barrier, no fear. They didn't play like domestic pets. They didn't wrestle or chase. They simply curled into one another, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, their bodies resting in silent understanding. Not dependence anymore, just connection. Briar didn't need Dakota to survive, but he still loved him, and Dakota, though no longer tasked with protection, still wanted to see him. Some bonds are forged in survival, others are built on something deeper, and when they met each week, something unspoken passed between them. We made it. We still belong. Even apart, we are never truly alone. Briar grew fast, his legs lengthened, his stride quickened. He became sleek, agile, powerful. The wildness returned to him, not in anger or fear, but in instinct. He climbed trees in seconds, stalked birds with quiet precision. His body had grown into what nature intended him to be. But even now, months later, when he heard the rumble of a familiar engine on the gravel road, he paused. He waited. Dakota always stepped out of the car first. The old Malamute moved slower now, his muscles stiffened in the cold, but he was steady, reliable. And Briar would meet him like clockwork, tail twitching, ears forward. No longer a kitten, but still the same soul who once survived a blizzard tucked into the ribs of a dog. Sometimes Sarah and the children would sit on the bench nearby and just watch. No one said much. They didn't need to. The story was still unfolding, written not in words but in moments. Quiet reunions, shared naps, eyes meeting across enclosures, breath sinking, ears flicking at the same time. A rhythm only they understood. The sanctuary called it hope and fur. Here every animal had a story. Some were messy, some were short, some never got a second chance. But some, like Dakota and Briar's, became something bigger. Proof that survival is not just about claws or teeth or instinct. Sometimes it's about kindness, a warmth found in the unlikeliest places, a bond between species that were never meant to meet. Briar might return to the wild someday, or he might stay, an ambassador for compassion, a symbol of what love can do when it refuses to follow the rules. But whatever his future, one truth remained unshaken. He never would have made it alone. And Dakota didn't just save his life. He gave him something far more rare, a place to belong.